If Christ is risen, nothing else matters. If Christ is not risen, nothing else matters. We live in a crazy world, with society falling into chaos, violence, shootings, political upheaval, a loss of meaning, the degradation of morality. We are very much not in a good place. One of the things about that, though, is that it is very easy in a world like that to get caught up in all sorts of questions of the day, and these are important questions, no doubt. But nonetheless, there are other questions that matter, questions that are bigger, questions that deal with things of a historical or maybe even an eternal nature. They're more fundamental, they are more existential. And the biggest question of all is this: is Jesus risen from the dead? You see, the answer to that question changes literally everything else. If Jesus is risen from the dead, then everybody should become a Christian. Literally everybody who accepts that claim must follow Christ, because he went round saying things like, "I am God," and they killed him for saying it, and then he rose from the dead and said, "Well, actually I did in fact say I was God." If that's true, then it doesn't matter what you feel, it doesn't matter what objections you might have, all of those things are secondary. That is the only real question that is worth thinking about. Now, on the other hand, if he is not risen from the dead, then that is the end of Christianity. If it's just that he was a man whose body decomposed somewhere outside of Jerusalem, then he was not God. He was, as C.S. Lewis put it, either a liar or a lunatic, and the whole thing is a scam. There's no truth to be found there whatsoever. Indeed, his followers were nothing other than a bunch of mixed up peasants following the ramblings of an insane man who died as a criminal outside the walls of a mid-sized Middle Eastern city. And this, by the way, is not just some logical argument. This is, in fact, the Bible's argument. The Apostle Paul writes that if Christ is not risen from the dead, then Christians are of all people to be most pitied. Those dying for their faith are dying for no reason. Those who live a life of spiritual discipline are doing so for no reason. Those who walk around in robes and pointy hats, well, they look actually pretty darn cool, but nonetheless, it is still pointless. And so this is very much the most important question, and it is the most important question of all history, but it is also the most important question of your life. And some people might think, well, that's a matter of faith, it's just blind belief, but let me assure you that it very much is not. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. The first of which being that Jesus' tomb was definitely empty. It is a historical fact that the body of Jesus of Nazareth was put in a tomb, and 3 days later, that tomb was empty. We know this for a few reasons. Firstly, we know that the body of Jesus was put into a tomb belonging to a man called Joseph of Arimathea. Now, this guy was well known. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, like the local Jewish council at the time. He was a little bit of a, local celebrity in the way that here in Northern Ireland, someone like Rory McIlroy or Jamie Dornan might be, or of course, yours truly. Not that anybody here knows who I am, but one day. But not only that, he also asked the permission of another, even better known guy, Pontius Pilate, to put Jesus' body in the tomb. So, if the followers of Jesus were just making this up and they'd put the body in some other tomb, both of these people could have been contacted and they would have said no, the body was never in that tomb to begin with. And bear in mind, yes, Joseph of Arimathea was ultimately later on a believer in Jesus, but Pontius Pilate definitely wasn't. He in fact was involved in putting Jesus to death. He would have no reason to lie about this. Furthermore, even Jesus' enemies admitted that the tomb was empty. You see, neither the Jewish leadership nor the Roman leadership in Jerusalem at the time were fans of Jesus, right? To the Romans, he was this political nuisance, but to the Jews, he was very much an existential threat and a blasphemer. But here's what they said. What they said was that the body of Jesus was stolen from the tomb by the disciples. That itself is an admission that the body is not in the tomb. And in the following months and years, as they were desperate to put a stop to the rise of Christianity, they could, if the body had been in the tomb, went there and taken it out and showed everybody. Because the whole premise of Christianity's spread was that Jesus had risen from the dead. So they could have stopped Christianity dead in its tracks. No pun intended. So that's reason one. Now reason two is this. There were hundreds of eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Jesus bodily risen from the dead and who were willing to die for those claims. So after the last argument, you might be tempted to think, okay, I accept that the tomb was empty, but it might well be the case that the disciples did get in there and steal the body. So let's examine that claim a little bit. Firstly, on the night that Jesus was arrested, his disciples were with him and they were in fact armed. We even see the apostle Peter take a swing at one of those guys with a sword and actually manages to cut off his ear, which incidentally, not the sign of a great swordsman, but after that the disciples run away and hide in the darkness. Now after Jesus died, the Jewish leadership were worried that the disciples would break in and steal the body for something like this. So what they asked for was permission for a Roman guard to be set outside the tomb. Now, the group that arrested Jesus in the garden, well, that was basically a rabble, but the ones outside the tomb, these were Roman soldiers. These were the best soldiers in the world. So, what you have to believe if you think they stole the body was that the disciples transformed in a couple of days from this group of incompetent cowards and became SEAL Team 6. And they managed to defeat this Roman guard. They also managed to do so without hurting any of them, because they would have, been arrested and put to death for that. So maybe they mind-tricked their way past them like Jedi. And even more incredibly, they decided to wait to launch such a rescue mission until Jesus was in fact dead. Now, I don't know a lot about rescue missions, but they do tend to be launched when people are very much still alive. Now, not only that, you can maybe make that claim, you can maybe think that they stole it if they became, wealthy, famous, had lots of girls, something like that. But these guys, well, they basically became the exact opposite. They became hated, they became infamous, they were faithful to one wife, they died for their claims, they lost everything. Just imagine if you were about to be executed for something that you thought was a lie that would maybe, make you rich and famous, but in fact was going to lead to your untimely demise. I think at that point you would quite willingly take it back. Now, one other way that people try and get out of this is saying that this was all a hallucination. But it can't be that, because we have stories of 500 people who saw Jesus alive at the same time after his death. Hallucinations don't work like that. If me and 499 of my friends decide to do acid, which I don't recommend, but one might see a pink elephant, another might see a person with wings, someone else may be able to understand Joe Biden.
America is a nation that can be defined in a single word. I was going to
But that's not the same as 500 people agreeing on what they saw. Now, one final way that people try and get out of this is something called the swoon theory. That sounds like something out of a Jane Austen novel, but that's the idea that Jesus wasn't really dead. He just passed out and he was put in a tomb and then he managed to escape himself. A few issues with that. Firstly, the Romans were trained killers. It talks about blood and water flowing from his side, which is in fact the plasma and red blood cells separating, which only happens after death. So they knew he was dead. But furthermore, imagine you had just received the beating of your life, been nailed to a cross for 6 hours, and then locked in a cave for several days with no food or water or medical attention. Do you think that if you escaped from such a situation, that you would be able to convince people that you were the Son of God back from the dead? Unlikely. So that's reason 2. Now, reason 3 is this. The appearances of Jesus after his death radically altered people's beliefs. And we'll start with the disciples here, because interestingly, they had no expectation that Jesus was going to come back from the dead. If we look around at their actions, They weren't sitting around hoping he would come back. They weren't eyeing up the tomb. They weren't checking whether or not he would rise. They were scattered, abandoned, in hiding, in despair. They were devastated. They had thought that Jesus was the Messiah. They expected him as such to come as a conquering king, drive the Romans out of Israel, lead some great military victory. They were not expecting him to be beaten and die as a criminal on a cross. And generally speaking, the Jews as a whole didn't really expect a resurrection in the middle of history. This was foreign to them. Even the Old Testament passages that we today can see talk about his resurrection do so in a way that's really only easy to see in hindsight. For the disciples, they would really have had to come up with this idea out of thin air and then all adopted it simultaneously. But what they saw of Jesus after he died convinced them to radically change what they believed. But that's not even the most exciting bit. The most exciting change is the change in beliefs among those who did not accept Jesus. If you read the Gospels, you'll see that Jesus' own family didn't believe him when he said he was God. His own brothers came to restrain him and put an end to his ministry at one point. And yet what we see after the resurrection is that James, Jesus' brother, worships him as God. Just imagine what it would take to provoke such a turnaround in thinking. I have a brother. He's a nice guy, right? But if one day he said to me, "Oh, I'm God, worship me," I'd hit him in the face, I'm going to be honest.
You're not God.
So what could cause such a change in someone's thinking about a family member? What could make you think that they are God? Well, I think rising from the dead is the kind of thing that would just about do it. Similarly with the Apostle Paul, bear in mind that this was a man who hated the church. He was imprisoning church members. He spent his entire life becoming the most radical, zealous Jew possible, which necessarily meant that he persecuted the early church. And yet, after seeing the resurrected Jesus, he gives his entire life to refuting the things that he had taught and believed. This is not unlike, say, Osama bin Laden releasing a video saying, "I have seen Jesus, I'm leaving Islam, I'm going to start Taliban church here in Afghanistan." It's a really convincing turnaround. And that is reason 3. So let's recap. Number 1, the tomb was empty. Number 2, there were eyewitnesses who died for their claims to have seen him alive. And number 3, those who claimed to have seen him alive radically changed their beliefs as a result, including people who didn't believe in him. As I said at the start, if Christ is risen, nothing else matters. Your preferences, lifestyle, preconceived notions, anything else you want to throw in there, they are all ultimately pretty irrelevant. A man who can claim to be God, who can predict his own death and his resurrection, can go to that death willingly, go into the grave, and come out again, is completely vindicated in his claims of divinity. A Jesus who rose from the dead is a Jesus who is God. Jesus did rise from the dead. He is God. Nothing else matters. Follow him.